When Kevin died, the world didn't stop spinning. That was the first betrayal. The coffee brewed as it always did. The sun slanted through the blinds with indifferent warmth, and the calendar still insisted it was Tuesday. But something inside me had gone silent, like a clock whose ticking had ceased, its hands forever frozen at the hour love disappeared. I was in the kitchen when Amanda called. Kevin's assistant, her voice a fractured mirror of composure. "Rachel," she said, my name breaking in her throat like glass, "it's Kevin." He collapsed during a meeting. "The paramedics are here. They're taking him to Northwestern Memorial." I remember the mug slipping from my hand, shattering into 1,000 tiny shards against the tile floor. But it wasn't the mug I mourned. It was the life I had built, collapsing just as suddenly. By the time I reached the hospital, he was already gone. The rest came in a blur. Apologies from strangers in sterile coats. A hand on my shoulder that did not feel warm. A clipboard thrust into my hands. Words like coronary, massive, instantaneous. Lily, our daughter, just 7 years old, waited at home with a neighbor, coloring her world in crayons while mine turned to ash. And yet, in the middle of it all, I did the only thing I could think to do. I called my parents. I was still shaking when I dialed. Kevin's name caught in my throat like a prayer I couldn't finish. I imagined my mother answering with her soothing voice, imagined my father's quiet strength. But what I got was something else. "Rachel, can this wait?" my mother said sharply. "We're at Sophia's birthday dinner." "She's blowing out her candles." Sophia, my sister, my parents' son, their crown jewel. My grief, it seemed, had picked an inconvenient moment. I barely remember hanging up. I remember the silence after, though. A silence louder than any scream. They didn't come that night. Or the next. But grief has a way of crystallizing things. Of showing you, with unnerving clarity, who you truly are to the people who claim to love you. Kevin had left everything in order. That was who he was, meticulous, thoughtful. His life insurance policy was generous, his savings carefully managed, his will explicit. He had provided for Lily and me with the kind of foresight that both comforted and gutted me. I could almost hear him, whispering, "I'll take care of you, even if I can't stay." And then, 3 days after his funeral, 3 days after I lowered my heart into the earth, beside his they came. My parents arrived at my doorstep in their Sunday best, eyes dry and resolute. Not a casserole in hand, not a single photograph of Kevin clutched to their chest. Just a purse, a pen, and practiced smiles. They offered brief condolences, voices lined with the kind of restraint that turns sympathy into a performance. Then, with the subtlety of wolves in tailored wool, my father said, "We wanted to talk to you about the estate." My chest tightened. "The estate? The inheritance," my mother clarified. "We think it's only fair that we receive 30%. As your family, we were part of Kevin's life too." Lily was sitting on the stairs, listening. I hadn't heard her come down. She stood up, slowly, with the kind of dignity no child should need to summon. Her hands were steady, her small frame clothed in the navy dress she'd insisted on wearing since the funeral. She walked past me, my brave, brilliant daughter, and disappeared into the living room. A moment later, she returned. She held an envelope. A plain white envelope, sealed tight. She handed it to my father. "This is what you came for, isn't it?" she asked, her voice quiet but certain. "Not Daddy. Not Mommy. Just this." They opened it. Their hands began to tremble. What they saw, I'll tell you. But not just yet. Because before the reckoning came the remembering. And to understand what was written on that paper, you'd have to understand the history etched into every word. The weight of a daughter always second best. The ache of a woman who gave everything and was still considered not enough. The silent ledger I kept of every wound dismissed, every favor expected, every time love was treated like a transaction. You'd have to understand how long I waited to be seen. And how, in that moment, my daughter did what I never dared. She drew the line. They didn't speak at first. Just stared down at the envelope like it had teeth. My father peeled it open, his hands no longer as steady as I remembered from childhood, those same hands that once taught me to ride a bike, now trembling like the illusion they'd carefully curated was beginning to collapse. Inside, folded with a care only a child could manage, was a single sheet of lined notebook paper. The top edge was jagged from where Lily had torn it out. At the top, in her tidy second-grade script, she'd written, "To Grandma and Grandpa." My mother's lips parted slightly as she read the first line. And then her face began to pale. It wasn't money. Not even close. It was a letter. A letter from Lily. "Dear Grandma and Grandpa, Mommy said you were busy when Daddy died, that you were at Aunt Sophia's birthday and couldn't come. But when I looked at Mommy's face that night, it didn't look like a day you should be busy." Her face looked like the sky when a storm is coming and no one brings their umbrella. We sat on the couch all night. Mommy held me so tight I couldn't breathe, but I didn't tell her to stop because I think that's the only way she could breathe. I asked her if you were coming and she said she didn't know. You didn't come. Then I heard you asking Mommy for inheritance, and I had to look that up because I thought maybe it was something nice. It isn't. So here is something better. This is a list of the things Daddy left behind. A secret pancake recipe that makes the corners crispy. A joke about turtles that only works if you say it in a turtle voice. A purple tie he said was lucky but never wore. A hug that made everything bad go away. And most of all, my mommy, who he said was his favorite person ever, even more than pizza. You can't have any of those. So there's nothing here for you. Love. Lily. My father stood frozen, lips tight, eyes darting from the letter to my face, then back to Lily, who stood at the base of the staircase like a tiny soldier, chin raised, dignity wrapped around her like armor. My mother's face was unreadable, a mask carefully held together by years of practiced performances, but her eyes, those betrayed her. She couldn't look at me. You taught her to write this, my father said, but his voice lacked its usual weight. No, I replied. I didn't even know she was writing it. She listens more than I wish she had to. Silence stretched between us like the distance of years we could never recover. I didn't fill it. I was done cushioning their discomfort. They left not long after. My mother said nothing. My father muttered something about needing to speak with an attorney, his default retreat whenever control slipped from his fingers. They left the letter behind. I found it later that night on the kitchen table. Lily had taken her bath, tucked herself into bed with the stuffed bear Kevin gave her for her 3rd birthday. I sat beside her a while, brushing her damp hair back from her forehead, marveling at the strength that lived inside her already. I whispered my gratitude into her small sleeping form. You saved me tonight, I thought. You said the thing I never could. And yet, the story didn't end with a slammed door or righteous satisfaction. Life rarely offers such clean resolutions. The days that followed were quiet, surreal. Like the world had softened out of respect or fear or both. But something fundamental had shifted. I no longer looked for their approval. They had shown me clear as day what I was worth to them. And my daughter had answered for me. There would be consequences, no doubt. Legal battles, whispered accusations, family emails laced with veiled insults. But I had something they could never steal again. Clarity. And Lily's letter? I framed it, hung it in the hallway across from Kevin's photo. It reminded me every day that we may lose love, but not our voice, not our truth. That letter was the start of something. In the weeks that followed, something strange began to happen in the silence my parents left behind. At first, I mistook it for numbness, the kind that pads you from the raw edge of grief. But then I realized it wasn't numbness. It was space. Space that had once been filled with their disapproval, their expectations, their judgment disguised as concern. Space that Kevin had tried to protect me from, wrapping me in his quiet strength like a buffer against the chill of my own bloodline. I used to think that family was something you had to earn. I see now it's something you choose. The house felt heavier without Kevin. His shoes still sat by the door, and I couldn't bear to move them. His cologne lingered on the collar of his winter coat. Sometimes I would sit with it, close my eyes, and pretend he'd just stepped out to run errands, that any moment he'd call and ask if I wanted anything from the corner bakery. And then the silence would stretch too long, and I'd open my eyes to the same empty hallway, and the ache would return like a tide I couldn't outrun. Lily grieved differently. Children do. Some nights she cried herself to sleep in my lap, asking the same questions over and over. Why did Daddy's heart stop? Is he in the clouds now? Will he remember us? And then there were days she'd skip through the house, humming to herself, as if the weight of death had simply lifted off her shoulders for a moment to let her breathe. I envied her for that. It was on one of those quieter mornings, weeks after the letter, when the next ripple came. A knock at the door. Not sharp like my parents' arrival. Softer, almost tentative. When I opened it, I was surprised to see my Aunt Elise, my mother's younger sister, the one who had always hovered at family gatherings like a background character, never saying much, never stirring conflict. She stood there in a tailored coat, eyes wide, a casserole dish in her hands like some artifact of a bygone ritual. I heard what happened, she said, her voice delicate. Not just about Kevin. About everything. I stepped aside to let her in, unsure of what to expect. She placed the dish on the counter like it might break the moment. Then she turned to me. I always thought your parents were cold, she said carefully, as if tasting the word for the first time. But I didn't realize how deep it went. I should have. I'm sorry I didn't speak up. Her words hit me harder than I anticipated. Because it wasn't just the apology. It was the quiet validation long overdue. We sat at the table, and for the first time in years, I told someone the truth, not the polished, polite version. The real one. About the constant comparisons to Sophia, the feeling of being an accessory in my own family, the countless times Kevin had shielded me from things I never even told him hurt. Aunt Elise listened. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't rush to defend anyone. She just saw me. You don't owe them anything, she said when I finished, her voice firm in a way that surprised me. Let the will say what it says. Let the lawyers handle it, but don't give them another piece of yourself. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to say that. Later that night, after Lily was asleep, I opened the old box Kevin kept tucked at the back of our closet. Inside were our wedding photos, love notes we'd passed during our early dates, and the small velvet box that once held my engagement ring. And at the very bottom, his journal. I'd never read it before. It felt sacred, private. But grief has a way of making things urgent. Like the universe whispers now. While you still can. I flipped to the final entry, dated just 2 weeks before he died. I worry about Rachel. Not because she's weak, but because she's always carrying everyone else's weight and no one notices. Especially her family. I wish they'd see her the way I do. Not as an accessory to someone else's story, but as the heartbeat of her own. If anything ever happens to me, I hope she remembers this. She was never the problem. She was the light. I clutched the journal to my chest and wept for the first time in days. Not just for him, but for all the versions of me that had quietly withered, waiting for permission to bloom. But no more. Lily's letter was a beginning. Kevin's words were a map. And somewhere beyond this grief, I was going to find my way. There's a moment in grief when the world forgets you're still grieving. When the calls taper off, the sympathy cards stop arriving, and people start talking about things like weather and errands again, as if your world hadn't been fundamentally altered. As if you should be, by now, adjusted to the absence. But absence doesn't shrink. It stretches. It follows you into grocery aisles, into traffic lights, into the silence of a Sunday morning. Kevin's absence had become a new room in my house, one I had to walk through daily. And each time I did, I passed old versions of myself, versions I was no longer willing to carry. The old Rachel, the obedient daughter, the peacemaker, the silent giver, had quietly died with Kevin. And in her place, something else was forming. Someone else. The first time I said no out loud and meant it was when my mother called a week after the envelope incident. She sounded composed, as if we could reset things with a casual tone. Rachel, I think we should talk. Sophia and I have been discussing options, ways the family could help you manage Kevin's assets responsibly. Options. Help. That word again, manage. For years, I'd translated their concern into some twisted version of love. But this time, I heard it for what it was, control dressed in pearls and politeness. No, I said calmly. A pause. No, I'm not interested. I'll be managing things just fine. Another pause, longer now. Don't be rash. We're your family. You were busy when he died, I said, voice steady. You didn't come for us. You came for what you thought he left behind. And now you want to help me manage that. Rachel, I'm done. And I hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I just stood there in the middle of the kitchen, one hand on the counter, the other still holding the phone. And I realized, for the first time in my life, I had chosen myself. In the days that followed, I began to rearrange not just the house, but the way I existed inside it. I took down photos of family members who never showed up when it mattered and replaced them with snapshots of Lily and Kevin, laughing in the backyard, their heads thrown back like sunlight itself had kissed them. I started seeing a therapist. I hadn't realized how many stories I was still carrying in silence, stories with jagged edges and quiet resentments. Grief, I learned, is a mirror. It shows you who is really standing with you when the world fell apart. I also found the courage to do something Kevin had always encouraged, but I never dared to try, launching my own consulting firm. I'd helped him manage accounts for years, done freelance bookkeeping for small businesses in our community. But I'd always called it side work, as if giving it a name would make it too real, too threatening to the roles others assigned me. Now, I chose to make it real. I named the business Lighthouse and Ledger. Kevin had once said I was his lighthouse, the steady beam when he lost his way. I figured if I could be that for him, I could be that for others too. I launched the website from our dining room table, Lily sitting across from me, painting hearts in watercolor while I wrote copy about integrity and resilience. She asked what I was doing, and I told her, building something of our own. Then came the letter from the family lawyer. My parents had officially filed to contest Kevin's will. They claimed emotional distress, financial entitlement, familial obligation. Words that turned my stomach. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I contacted a friend of Kevin's, an estate attorney we'd met at a company function years ago. His name was Marcus, and when I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. We'll handle this, he said. Kevin was smart. His language was airtight. They won't win. But he paused before hanging up. They're doing this to rattle you. Don't let them. I won't, I told him. Because I'd seen what happened when I stayed silent. And now I knew what happened when I didn't. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, I walked out to the backyard. It was cool and quiet. The stars hung like promises. I stood in the grass barefoot and looked up. Kevin, I whispered, we're okay. She's okay. I'm okay. I felt nothing supernatural, no breeze, no sign. Just a stillness that felt like peace. And maybe that's what strength really is. Not fire, not fury. But the quiet knowing of who you are when no one is watching. I was no longer just a widow. I was Rachel. And I had finally stepped into the shape of my own name. The summons arrived in a pale blue envelope, as if civility could soften the slap of betrayal. A formal letter from the probate court. A hearing had been scheduled. My parents were contesting Kevin's will, citing vague claims of emotional investment and expected inclusion. It read like satire. Only it wasn't. For a moment, I stood frozen in the hallway, the envelope still open in my hands. Lily sat cross-legged on the living room rug, humming to herself as she arranged stickers in a scrapbook. Kevin's voice echoed in my memory, "Don't let them take more from you than you're willing to give." I folded the paper gently and set it aside. I'd already given too much. I called Marcus that afternoon. We expected this, he said calmly. They're banking on intimidation. But you've got truth and Kevin's exact wording on your side. Still, the idea of a courtroom, of having to prove my place in my husband's legacy, churned something bitter in my chest. I'd been dismissed enough in my life to know what doubt looked like on people's faces. I refused to see it again. So I began preparing not just for court, but for every version of myself I might have to face. The day of the hearing, I wore navy blue. Kevin always said it made my eyes look fierce. Lily stayed with Aunt Elise, who had quietly stepped into our lives with grace and tenderness. She'd become the kind of family I never thought I'd find, soft where my parents were sharp, steady where they were conditional. When I entered the courthouse, my parents were already seated across the room. My mother wore pearls. My father wore that same tired smugness he used to mask insecurity. They didn't look at me, which suited me fine. The judge was a woman in her 60s, silver hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun. She read through the documents silently at first, her brows drawing closer with each page. Marcus stood and addressed the court, laying out Kevin's will with clarity and authority. He presented evidence of our life together, of our shared finances, of the provisions Kevin made not just for Lily and me, but for the future he knew he might not be around to see. It was thorough, respectful. Then it was my parents' turn. My mother stood first, hands clasped, voice smooth. We were part of Kevin's life. We helped raise Rachel. We believe it's only fair. The judge cut her off. Ma'am, the court isn't interested in fairness as sentiment. It's interested in the law. My father fumed, his face turning the same shade it used to during dinner table arguments. We deserve a share. He was our family, too. I finally looked up, met his eyes. My voice didn't shake. No, he was my family. You didn't come when he died. You didn't help when I needed you most. You came when you thought there was money. The courtroom fell still. Not a gasp, not a murmur, just stillness, like the moment before glass breaks. The judge turned to me. Mrs. Morgan, do you wish to speak further? I stood, and with every word, I poured out the quiet truths I'd swallowed for decades. About the birthday party. About the inheritance request. About the letter Lily wrote. About what family means and what it doesn't. They didn't lose a son, I said quietly. They lost access. And now they want to convert grief into gain. But the real inheritance Kevin left behind wasn't his money. It was the way he loved. And they were never part of that. The ruling was swift. Contest denied. The will would stand as written. My parents left without a glance back, their exit as empty as their arrival. But I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. Some chains don't clink when they fall. They dissolve. And suddenly, the air felt easier to breathe. That night, I returned home to find Lily asleep on the couch, her arms wrapped around a stuffed rabbit. Aunt Elise had made tea, and we sat in the kitchen, soft light washing over the table like a benediction. You were brave today, she said. No, I replied. I was finally honest. Later, I sat in the quiet of Kevin's study. I lit the candle he used to burn while working, cedar wood and tobacco, and opened his journal one more time. Between the lines, I could still feel his presence. Not haunting, not sorrowful. Just steady. Just Kevin. I did it, love, I whispered. I kept the promise. I kept her safe. And I kept me. Outside the window, the moon hung low and full. A witness. A blessing. And maybe even a beginning. The courtroom was behind me now, but its echoes lingered in odd places, during coffee runs, while folding Lily's laundry, even in the hush before sleep. Not because I regretted what I said. Quite the opposite. It was the first time I'd said something that wasn't tailored to keep peace. It was built to protect truth. But the silence that followed? It didn't feel empty. It felt open. A space I could finally fill with something of my own choosing. Kevin used to say that grief was just love with nowhere to go. But now I had a direction. Not away from Kevin, but forward, with him folded into everything I was becoming. Lighthouse and Ledger began to bloom. It started small, 2 clients, both local business owners who had known Kevin and respected him deeply. They didn't come to me out of pity. They came because they believed in what I was building. Every invoice I sent, every balance sheet I reviewed, every client meeting where I sat across the table not as someone's widow, but as a founder, it stitched a little more of me back together. And then came the unexpected. I received an email from a woman named Clarissa Hart, an executive at a regional credit union, looking for a consultant to help streamline their community lending reports. Your name was recommended by someone who said you're sharp, discreet, and understand more than just numbers. Kevin's old colleague. I took the meeting. Clarissa was a woman in her late 40s with a sharp jawline and a no-nonsense presence. But within 5 minutes, she leaned in and said, "Rachel, I've read about people like you. But meeting one is different. You didn't just survive loss. You got louder. That's rare." I didn't quite know how to respond to that. So I simply said, "Thank you." We signed a 6-month contract that afternoon. Lily, meanwhile, was adjusting in her own way. She'd started seeing the school counselor, not because she was acting out, but because she asked for someone to talk to who wasn't mommy. I took that as the healthiest request a 7-year-old could make. Some nights, she'd curl up beside me in bed and ask questions that caught me off guard. "Do you think Daddy sees us?" "Maybe," I'd say, stroking her hair. "But I think more than anything, he feels us." "Then I hope he feels me being brave," she whispered once. "You and me both, sweetheart," I thought. The phone calls from my parents stopped entirely after the court ruling. No voicemail. No letter. Not even a shallow attempt at apology. I should have been angry. But I wasn't. There's a peace that comes with letting go of people who only show up when they want something. It's like taking off shoes that never really fit and realizing your feet had been aching for years. What surprised me more were the messages from people I didn't expect, distant cousins, an old high school friend, even Kevin's old gym buddy. Notes that said things like, "I saw the hearing in the paper. You spoke beautifully." Lily's letter, "My daughter wrote one too. Different story. Same heartbreak. Thank you for showing that quiet people can roar when it matters." I didn't set out to be visible. I had spent most of my life becoming smaller so others could be comfortable. But now the spotlight felt different, warmer, like it wasn't meant to expose me, but to honor what I'd survived. One evening, I found myself back in Kevin's favorite park, the one with the crooked bench near the duck pond. I brought a blanket and a thermos of coffee, and I sat watching the trees sway in their summer hush. A little boy threw breadcrumbs to the ducks, his father nearby, laughing in a way that pinched at something in me. But it didn't break me. Instead, I pulled out a notebook and began to write not grief this time, but possibility. A checklist for our future. Enroll Lily in swimming lessons. Redecorate the spare room into a guest space. Take a road trip, just us girls. Speak at a local women's business panel, Clarissa had asked. Start journaling for myself, not just to remember Kevin, but to hear me again. The moon rose slow and full behind the trees. I looked up and smiled, whispering, "We're okay, Kev." Not because everything was healed, but because healing had begun. It didn't look like closure. It looked like breath. Like room. Like beginning again, not from nothing, but from everything we carried forward. The first thing I did that made me feel fully alive again was repaint the living room. It seems small, I know, but that room had been frozen in time since the day Kevin died. The throw pillows he picked out still fluffed in their particular order. The blanket he folded draped over the same armrest. The lamp turned slightly toward the reading chair he loved. But life is not a mausoleum. So one Saturday, with Lily away at a friend's sleepover, I pulled the furniture away from the walls, opened the windows wide, and began painting the space in a shade called morning smoke. A soft, silvery blue that reminded me of fog and clean slates. By midnight, the room looked like a fresh breath, like a place we could laugh in again. It wasn't about erasing Kevin. It was about inviting life back in, room by room. That same weekend, Lily surprised me with a drawing she had worked on quietly for days. It showed our house, our real one, but with flowers blooming from every window. Inside, she had drawn herself, me, and Kevin as a floating heart above the roof, arms stretching downward like roots, like love still holding us from the sky. I made our family how it feels now, she explained. Not how it used to be. Not how others expected. But how she felt it. I framed it the next morning. It hangs in the hallway now, next to Lily's letter to my parents. 2 testaments. One to grief. One to growth. Both to truth. Lighthouse and Ledger began to thrive faster than I imagined. Word spread in our community, not just about my services, but about my story. People weren't just hiring me because I was competent, they were hiring me because I understood. Loss, rebuilding, reinvention. I began offering workshops at the local library, budgeting for new beginnings, finance after grief, money as empowerment. They weren't packed, but they were sacred. Women cried sometimes, laughed too. And at the end of every session, someone always came up to me and whispered, "Thank you for saying what I didn't know how to say." I nodded, because I had lived there too, in the space between silence and saying. Then came the email from Sophia. It was short, almost clinical. "Rachel, I heard about what happened. I didn't know they asked you for money. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For not reaching out. For everything. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." There was a time I would have responded immediately. A time I would have leapt at even a sliver of connection. But now I sat with it. I let the silence hold my answer. Because sometimes the boundary isn't punishment, it's preservation. And Sophia, whatever her intentions, still stood inside the house that never opened its door to my pain. That same week, I found Kevin's old camera. It was tucked into a box marked miscellaneous, alongside chargers for devices we no longer owned, and a half-finished crossword puzzle he must have abandoned mid-thought. I charged the camera and flipped through the photos. There we were. At the apple orchard. At Lily's preschool graduation. At a beach where our feet were buried in the sand, smiling like the world had no sharp edges. I cried, of course, but not with the same ache as before. This cry was soft, like the ache had finally found its place inside me. I started taking photos again. Of Lily. Of the meals we cooked together. Of the little life moments that no one else would see but that mattered anyway. A hand on mine during a movie. A sock puppet show she put on for me from behind the couch. A rainy Tuesday morning where we didn't do anything but be. I posted some of them online under a new handle, The Quiet Rebuild. Strangers messaged me. "Thank you for showing grief doesn't end in ashes. I lost my husband last year. Your words are like breath. This is the kind of strong I didn't know I could be." Strength, I'm learning, isn't just the voice that roars. It's also the silence that refuses to disappear. It's the woman who shows up to court not for vengeance, but to draw a line in love. It's the mother who frames her daughter's letter as scripture. It's the founder who turns pain into purpose. It's me, Rachel. Widow. Mother. Builder of soft spaces and strong boundaries. And I've only just begun. Grief has a peculiar way of giving you new eyes. It sharpens certain things. Softens others. What once felt unbearable becomes manageable. What once seemed small now carries weight. A single sentence can shake your foundation or set you free. That's what happened the day I received a letter. An actual letter, not an email, not a text. Cream-colored envelope. My name in slanted handwriting I hadn't seen in over a year. It was from my father. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Kevin and I once folded laundry while Lily colored her way through childhood. The envelope trembled slightly in my hands. My breath caught somewhere between curiosity and dread. Inside was a single page. No greeting. No apology. Just this. "We never expected you to take it this far. Families have disagreements, but courtrooms? That was a disgrace. You embarrassed us. You embarrassed yourself. We raised you better than this." That was it. No signature. Just silence wrapped in judgment. I didn't tear the letter. I didn't cry. I simply slid it into the drawer next to Lily's drawing and thought, even now, they mistake silence for obedience. And clarity for shame. But I knew better. That night, after Lily fell asleep, I made a cup of chamomile tea and sat on the back porch, wrapped in Kevin's old sweater. The stars blinked like they were waiting for me to speak. So I did. I'm not ashamed, I whispered. Not of protecting what Kevin left us. Not of standing up in court and refusing to be erased. Not of building a life from the shards. A few days later, I shared a piece of the story online. Not the letter itself, just the truth it represented. Sometimes the people who raised you will resent the strength they didn't expect you to find. Speak anyway. Stand anyway. You don't owe them your silence just because they gave you your name. It went viral. I didn't mean for it to, but maybe some truths are waiting to echo. The comments were filled with stories. Thousands of them. A woman who was written out of her family for leaving an abusive marriage. A man who found peace after walking away from parents who never saw him beyond his career. A single mother who was told she owed her ex-in-laws access to her son after her partner died, even though they'd ignored them both in life. I read each one with reverence. We weren't alone. We were just quiet. Until we weren't. One of those messages came from a woman named Jordan, a therapist who specialized in family trauma and grief. She invited me to co-host a webinar with her, The Cost of Conditional Love. I hesitated at first. Speaking publicly about my pain had never been the plan. But Kevin's voice nudged me forward. You always told the truth, even when it scared you, he once said. So I said yes. And that night, as I sat in front of the camera, I didn't try to sound polished. I didn't try to sound wise. I just told the truth. About loss. About lines. About how hard it is to unlearn the belief that love must be earned, even at your own expense. Afterward, Jordan said, Rachel, you've turned survival into witness. That's not small. Meanwhile, Lily was thriving. She had a new best friend named Danny. They were inseparable, braiding each other's hair, swapping stickers, and building elaborate Lego towns on our living room floor. When Danny's mom dropped her off one Saturday, she paused at the doorway. I just want to say, she said softly, Lily talks about you like you're magic. I smiled. She's the magic. But later, as I watched them play, I thought, maybe it's both of us. Maybe we're rebuilding something sacred from all the things that were never offered to us. I keep Kevin's journal near my bedside now. Sometimes I read it before sleep. Sometimes I don't need to, because his words live in me now. So do mine. And the woman I used to be, the one who asked for so little, who apologized for her needs, who made herself small to fit inside someone else's definition of good, I don't miss her. But I honor her, because she walked through fire without knowing where it led. And somehow, she became me. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind no one would mark as meaningful. Clouds hung low but not heavy. The kind of sky that whispered, pause. Lily had just left for school, her backpack bouncing as she ran to meet the bus, one braid already loosening like it always did by lunchtime. And I stood in the kitchen, still barefoot, still holding my second cup of coffee, and realized. I felt peace. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that came after a win or a big announcement. Just the quiet kind that settled in your bones when nothing hurt anymore. The house didn't echo with grief. It echoed with living. There were dishes in the sink. Notes on the fridge. New books on the nightstand. Life was here not as a monument to what we'd lost, but as a canvas for what we were creating. And I no longer waited for the next blow, the next demand, the next disappointment in an envelope. Because I'd finally stopped bracing. Later that week, I received an invitation to speak at a women's leadership panel in Chicago. Clarissa had submitted my name. We need someone who knows how to build something when the world falls apart, she'd written. I sat with that sentence for a long time. Because for so long, I hadn't seen myself as a builder. I saw myself as a survivor. A responder. A woman who held together what others broke. But she was right. I had built something. Not just a business. Not just stability for Lily. I had built boundaries. Integrity. A voice I no longer apologized for. I accepted the invitation. The panel was held in a high-rise overlooking the lake. I wore a navy-wrap dress Kevin once called my warrior dress and stepped onto that stage with a calm heart. The moderator asked, "Rachel, what do you think is the most underrated leadership trait?" I smiled. Listening. To others, yes. But more importantly, to yourself. There was a pause. Then nods. I spent years mistaking silence for peace. Thinking if I didn't speak up, I was being good. But good isn't the same as whole. And listening to yourself, your instincts, your grief, your joy, that's the beginning of everything. Afterward, a woman in her 50s came up to me, eyes glassy. Your words felt like my story. Just 30 years later. I took her hands gently and said, "Then maybe now is your beginning." That night, back home, I tucked Lily into bed and she asked, "Did you help people today?" "I hope so," I whispered. "Then Daddy's proud." 7 words. But they filled the room. Spring came early that year. The kind of spring that made you want to open every window in the house and let the ghosts out with the dust. Lily and I started planting things, herbs in the kitchen windowsill, tiny sunflowers in the backyard, even a small lemon tree in a pot by the door. She named it Hope. It was her idea. One afternoon, while Lily was at a playdate, I pulled out the last of Kevin's journals. The one with the frayed edges, the one I hadn't touched since the day of the funeral. Inside, on the very last page, was a post-it I'd never noticed. It said, "If anything happens to me, promise me this. Build joy. Not just survival. Joy." And beneath it, scribbled smaller. "Also, please keep the coffee machine clean. It deserves better." I laughed so hard I cried. Not the broken kind. The grateful kind. Because even now, Kevin was still keeping his promises. Still loving us forward. I stood by the lemon tree that evening, notebook in hand. And I wrote, "The woman I was would never believe the woman I've become." Not because she was weak, but because she never knew freedom could feel the soft. This earned. We're not just surviving anymore. We're blooming. The anniversary of Kevin's death arrived like a whisper, not a wave. I had expected it to crash into me, to level me the way grief once had. But instead, it came softly. Like a familiar song playing from another room, recognizable, yes, but no longer commanding all my attention. That morning, Lily climbed into bed with me, still in her pajamas, her hair a wild halo around her face. She tucked herself against me like she used to in those early days, when neither of us could sleep without the other. "Do you think Daddy would like the lemon tree?" she asked. "I think he'd love it," I said. "Especially that you named it Hope." She nodded. "Hope makes things grow, right?" "Exactly." We lay there a while longer, wrapped in quiet, the kind that only belongs to people who've survived something and still choose softness. That afternoon, we visited the lake. Kevin loved that lake. It was where we picnicked the first summer we moved here. Where Lily first learned to skip rocks. Where he once carved our initials into a tree, bashful as a teenager, even in his 30s. We brought sandwiches, juice boxes, and a small notebook. One of Kevin's old ones, half used, still bearing faint outlines of budgets and doodles in the margins. I handed it to Lily. "Do you want to write him something?" She didn't ask why. Just nodded and sat cross-legged on the blanket, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth the way she did when she was focused. When she finished, she handed it back. Inside, in careful print. "Dear Daddy, we are okay now." Mommy laughs more. I laugh more. We planted things. Thank you for being part of us. I still talk to you when it rains. Love, Lily. I kissed the top of her head and whispered, "Me too." Back home, I lit the candle Kevin always used when working late. I poured a glass of his favorite wine. And I read a letter I had written to him the night before. "Kevin, it's been a year. A year of breaking. A year of building. A year of learning I was capable of things I never asked to be strong enough for. Your death didn't just hollow out our house. It hollowed out the parts of me that thought I had to be small to keep peace. That silence was safer than truth. That love meant giving until there was nothing left. But something remarkable happened in the aftermath. I found myself. Not the version of me that smiled at family dinners while swallowing the ache. Not the woman who tiptoed around her own needs, but the woman you saw all along. Thank you for that. For believing in who I could become even when I didn't. We're still here. Still choosing joy. Still carrying you in everything we plant, protect, and build. And I promise, no matter what, we will keep growing. Love. Rachel. That night, I didn't dream of funerals or farewells. I dreamed of a garden. Sunlight spilled across rows of lavender and lemon trees. Lily danced between them, hair braided with wildflowers. And Kevin stood at the edge, hands in his pockets, watching us with that crooked smile. When I turned to look at him, he nodded once, like he'd been waiting for this moment all along. And then he faded, not with pain, but with peace. The next morning, I wrote a new note for the fridge. Not a grocery list. Not an invoice. Just this. Some days will still ache. That's okay. But we are not lost. We are living. And that's more than enough. Lily read it before school. She gave me a thumbs up and said, "That's a good one, Mom." I smiled. Because it was. And so were we. It was a Tuesday again. Funny how the most ordinary days become mile markers for the extraordinary. Not because of what happens on them, but because of what they hold. I was standing in the doorway of Lily's room, watching her wrestle her way into a mismatched outfit she insisted was perfect. She looked up at me, arms tangled in the sleeves, and grinned. "Can I wear this even if it's weird?" "You can wear anything that makes you feel like you," I said. And she did. And I meant it. After dropping her off at school, I stopped by a local bookstore, the small, independent kind that smells like ink and rain. Kevin used to take me there on weekends. He'd browse the nonfiction shelves while I lost myself in poetry. Today, I wasn't there to escape. I was there to reclaim. I wandered past rows of stories until I found the one I didn't know I was looking for, a journal with a worn leather cover, soft as memory. I bought it without thinking. Later that night, I opened it at the kitchen table and wrote on the first page, "This is not a story of loss. It is a story of what survived." In the following weeks, something shifted. Not just inside me, but around me. The women from the workshop started meeting monthly. They called it the Rebuild Circle. Some brought wine. Others brought cookies. All brought truth. One night, Maria, whose husband had left her for someone half her age, said, "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm allowed to speak without permission." There were nods. I understood. Permission had always been an invisible currency, one we begged for without realizing we could mint our own. At home, Lily asked if we could frame another picture for the hallway. It's of Daddy, but I drew him with angel wings this time. He looks like a superhero. I framed it immediately. And next to it, I added one of her and me, side by side, arms linked, crowns of daisies on our heads. She'd drawn us smiling, even with clouds in the sky. "You made it rain in the picture," I noticed. "Because sometimes it still rains," she said, "but we don't stop playing." Out of the mouths of children comes gospel. The letter drawer was nearly full now. Not of bitterness, but of reminders. Lily's notes. Kevin's scribbles. My own truths, written down so I wouldn't forget the shape of my voice. I opened it one morning and removed the letter my father had sent, the one full of blame. I didn't reread it. I didn't need to. I walked it to the fireplace. And without ceremony, I fed it to the flame. Some stories aren't meant to be archived. They're meant to be released. The ash curled, lifted, vanished. And in its place, room. I've started painting again. Not just in stolen minutes or late at night. I carved out a space in the garage, turned it into a makeshift studio. Kevin had always wanted that for me. He once told me, Your art is a place people will rest in, even when they don't know they need to. Now, as I brush color onto canvas, I think about all the people who were never given a space to become, who were taught to be useful before they were taught to be whole. This studio is my resistance, my resurrection. One evening, I found Lily sitting in the garden, staring up at the lemon tree. Do you think trees remember? Remember what? Everything. I sat beside her. Maybe not the details, but I think they remember how to grow, even when they've been cut down, even when the seasons hurt. She nodded. Then I think we're like trees. Yes, baby. We are exactly like trees. And so we keep growing. In spaces that once held pain. In houses that no longer echo with expectation. In bodies that carry both sorrow and softness. We grow. Because the past shaped us, but it will not cage us. Because love is not defined by presence, but by what we build in its absence. Because what we lost taught us how to protect what remains. And because, after everything, we are still, gloriously, defiantly alive. There's a quiet that settles when you no longer live waiting for the other shoe to drop. It's not the absence of noise, not a silence forged by fear or withdrawal. It's the kind of quiet that comes when you've made peace with the sound of your own voice, when you no longer shrink from your reflection, when you've stopped apologizing for needing to be held, even if you had to hold yourself. That's the quiet I woke up to one Sunday morning as light spilled across my bedroom like blessing. Lily had crawled into bed sometime in the night, her small hand tucked into mine, her breath steady and soft. I watched her sleep, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel haunted. I felt anchored. This was my life. Imperfect. Hard one. And finally, mine. After breakfast, we drove to the community center. It was family day, and I'd been invited to speak again, this time not about business, but about rebuilding after loss. I wore a simple cream blouse and jeans. Nothing fancy. Just the version of myself I trusted most. Honest, steady, enough. The room wasn't full, but those who came sat close, not for spectacle, but for connection. I used to think surviving meant silence, I began. That if I looked okay, no one would ask about the bruises on my spirit. But grief taught me something no family member ever did. I am allowed to outgrow what hurt me. A woman in the front row wept openly. I didn't rush to comfort her. I let her cry. Because tears are proof that someone's truth has been heard, even if for the first time. Afterward, a teenage girl approached me, barely 16, with eyes that carried too many stories for someone so young. Do you think people like us ever stop missing the people who should have protected us? I bent to meet her gaze. No, I said. But we do stop mistaking their absence for our worth. She nodded. I hugged her. We were all someone's daughter once. That evening, Lily and I curled up on the couch with cocoa and a movie. Halfway through, she paused the screen and looked at me with that thoughtful seriousness she's always carried. Do you ever get scared still? She asked. All the time, I replied. But you don't act scared. That's the trick, I smiled. You do things anyway. She thought about that, then nodded. I want to be like that too. You already are. Later that night, after she'd gone to bed, I walked outside and stood under the sky. I thought about Kevin, about the letters, the courtroom, the wounds that no longer bled but still left marks in certain lights. I thought about the child I used to be, the girl who gave and gave, hoping one day someone would notice. And I thought about the woman I had become. I whispered into the breeze, thank you. To Kevin, for loving me whole. To Lily, for teaching me joy. To myself, for staying when everything told me to vanish. I reached for my journal and wrote. They never saw me, not really. But I am no longer waiting to be seen by those who prefer blindness. I have built a life with my own hands. One full of laughter, softness, boundaries, and bloom. This is what it means to survive. Not to be untouched by pain, but to choose, every day, to keep planting joy anyway. Somewhere in the garden, the lemon tree shivered in the night air. And I swear I heard it whisper, More will come. Spring melted into early summer, and the garden was suddenly alive with color. Sunflowers turned their faces upward like they had something to say. The lemon tree was beginning to fruit, small, hard green ovals, stubborn in their promise. Lily named them. Every single one. "This one is Joy," she said, pointing. "That one's Hope, like the tree. And that little one is Kevin Jr." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the watering can. She didn't flinch. "I think Daddy would like being a lemon. I think he'd love it." And somehow he felt closer than ever. The business was growing, too. Lighthouse and Ledger had just landed a new nonprofit client, a shelter for women starting over after abuse or abandonment. When I met with the director, she said, "We need someone who understands the difference between safety and freedom." I looked at her for a moment and said, "They're not the same, but you can't have one without the other." She nodded. We signed the contract. Afterward, I sat in my car and cried, not out of sadness, but because I realized I was becoming the person I once needed. Not just for Lily. For myself. And maybe, too, for every quiet woman watching from the margins, wondering if she was allowed to take up space. That evening, Lily found one of Kevin's old shirts in a donation bag. She pulled it out like it was treasure. "This still smells like him," she whispered. I took it from her gently, pressed it to my face. She was right. Time hadn't stripped it entirely. We didn't cry. We didn't need to. Instead, she asked if she could sleep with it. And that night, as I passed her room, I saw her wrapped in the soft cotton, peaceful. Not because she had forgotten him, but because she no longer feared the remembering. We received a letter in the mail a few days later from the lawyer. Kevin's life insurance had quietly matured into a small trust. Nothing extravagant, but enough to seed Lily's future if managed wisely. I stared at the paperwork, a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying lifting from my chest. He had thought of us even there, in the quiet math of his planning. I read through the details with care. There was a note in the margin from Kevin. "Use this when you're ready to build. Not just to survive. To thrive." He always knew what to say. Even now. That night, I sat with a cup of tea and mapped out a new vision. Not just for the business. For us. I called it the Foundation. A quiet dream, a nonprofit arm of my company that would provide free financial counseling and small grants to women rebuilding after loss. I would name it after Kevin's favorite phrase, the thing he always whispered when I doubted myself. "You already are." That would be the name. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say to someone isn't, "You will be okay." It's, "You already are." Lily came downstairs while I was sketching the first draft. "What's this?" she asked. "It's something I want to build. For people who've lost, but still want to grow." She looked at the paper, then at me, then smiled. "Can I help?" "Always." We stayed up late that night, dreaming. She said she wanted to design the logo. I said I wanted it to feel like a lighthouse, but softer. Something you don't just see, but feel. Like the warmth of home you didn't know you were allowed to return to. She drew something simple. A house with a light in every window. And underneath, in her blocky handwriting, "We see you." When I sent the first draft to Clarissa, she called me within minutes. "Rachel," she said, voice trembling, "this isn't just a project. It's a movement." I smiled. "It's a thank you. To Kevin." "Yes. And to every woman who ever thought her voice didn't matter. This is for her." The lemon tree bore its first ripe fruit the same week we received the nonprofit paperwork approval. Lily picked the first lemon with a reverence I couldn't describe. We made lemonade that afternoon. It was tart, strong, and exactly right. Just like us. We drank it on the porch as the sun set. She looked up at me and said, "You're not just my mom, you know. You're kind of everyone's lighthouse now." I didn't answer. I just reached for her hand. Because sometimes, silence is not emptiness. It's honor.